our guests. It's a real privilege and joy to be joined by Esther Lightcap Meek. Esther is a philosopher, an epistemologist. She taught for a number of years at Covenant Seminary before taking up a position as professor of philosophy at Geneva College in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, which is a delightfully named place. I have to find out the story behind that. Maybe it will come into tonight's presentation, I'm not sure. She's also a Fujimura Institute scholar, working with the Japanese artist Makoto Fujimura, and she's written a number of books. Her first, I believe, was her 2003 Longing to Know, The Philosophy of Knowledge for Ordinary People. She followed that in 2011 with Loving to Know, which is a fuller account of her Christian epistemology. In 2014, she wrote a shorter book, I'm going to get the name wrong, something like a handbook for knowing. Esther, sorry.
A little manual for knowing.
Manual for knowing. Thank you for the
That
correction.
hand in it.
And then in 2017, most recently, she brought out Contact with Reality, Michael Polanyi's Realism and Why It Matters. It's wonderful to have her with us. And thank you so much for being with us, Esther.
It's great to be with you. And I actually have seen the Round Church. I was there in 2019. I had to give a paper and I was running around, before 9 and after 5 with nobody telling me what to notice. But I do have several pictures of that building. And now I find you after I've left Cambridge. So.
Well, that's wonderful. It would be lovely to welcome you back after things settle down sufficiently. It's also wonderful to be joined by Kristi Mair, who's going to be in conversation with Esther. Kristi is a research fellow and lecturer in philosophy, ethics, and apologetics at Oak Hill College in London. She previously worked for 8 years as a staff worker for the Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship. She holds a BA in philosophy and theology. She also has a master's in philosophy of religion and is currently a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, looking into epistemology. She hosts a podcast with Andy Bannister, a friend of ours based up at SOLAS, and she wrote her first book, More Truth, in 2019. So we're really excited to hear from both Esther and Kristi in what promises to be a wonderful engagement. And I will hand over now to Kristi.
Oh, Joshua, thank you so much. And just to add my word of greetings to you. It's really great to see so many new faces and a few familiar faces as well. Welcome to this evening. I know that Joshua said that some of us will be in conversation with Esther, but actually I think we're all here because we're dying to hear from Esther herself, Professor Meek. Esther, it's such a joy to be with you this evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on knowing. Gosh, I mean, where do we begin? This is such a wonderful, life-giving, huge topic that I think I've said to you before that coming into your work has just completely changed my life, actually. And I'm profoundly indebted to you for your great wisdom and for your love of the Lord in so many ways. So thank you so much, Esther.
You're so welcome.
Sorry, it's that classic Zoom issue, isn't it, where one person stops talking and the other one starts. What are we going to say?
I just said you're welcome.
Gratefully received, so gratefully received. So just a note, really, I think, from myself before I just dig into asking you lots and lots of questions, Esther, is I first came to your work by way of a prayer, actually, that I asked, I uttered to the Lord, in that philosophy is very much dominated by the question of certainty, isn't it? You can know something if you're certain about it. And I saw that very quickly there are many things we can't be certain about. And so that kind of left me in a quagmire, really, of just thinking, well, what can I know then? What can I trust? And for me in particular, that landed with the scriptures, with God's word. So how can I actually know and trust that this is God speaking to me? And so I asked the Lord to direct my footsteps in what I was reading, and I came across your book, Loving to Know. And through your work, I've encountered many, many wonderful delights, and I won't repeat it because I know that you're going to share lots of it this evening. But I think one of my highlights from your life and work, Esther, has been getting to lead you around a very, very, very amateur tour of London town.
We'll call it a romp.
Yeah,
it was a romp.
It was a romp, and it was so funny because Esther just kept asking, "Oh, so what's this?" And I was like, "I've got no idea. Do you know what this crest means on Buckingham Palace?" "No, I've got no idea, but I can tell you why the railings are painted black. That's all I've got." But a part of our romp involved a tour of it was the National Art Gallery, wasn't it? And I think that moment that we walked into the room at the back in which the Caravaggio is housed, the Supper at Emmaus, I think it's going to come up in a moment. And I just remember seeing the look on your face, Esther, when we saw that painting in real life before us. Just your admiration, your awe, your wonder, your delight. It was a really moving moment, actually. And so I just love you to share with us, what on earth does this painting have to do with knowing, and why is it so important to you personally?
Oh, thank you for asking. It is the painter's rendition of the most important "oh, I see it" moment in life. And so I, as an epistemologist, I've kind of taken that aha moment, the act of insight, as paradigmatic for all of knowing. And there's Jesus, the one and only, being revealed in the breaking of the bread, and those two disciples. I think their shock and the aha is being caught. By the way, if you try to Google aha moment, just to find, something to stick in your PowerPoint, all you get is posed pictures. But this one captures the real thing. So I'm so pleased that it's on the front of my book, Loving to Know. And for me, that moment, as you might remember, Kristi, was the first time I realized that the one disciple has a seashell on his jerkin. And all these years, since 2011, I've been looking at the front cover of my book, and I never saw that. And I had just come from France, where I was visiting some missionary friends down on one of the pilgrimage trails at the very south of France, and had become quite acquainted with the seashell as the pilgrim sign. And so there he is. And in my book, Little Manual for Knowing, I talk about the Magi and the idea of pilgrimage to gift. And the Magi, somehow in my brain wiring, I've got the Magi turning into the guys on the road to Emmaus. So I'm sure it couldn't be that way, but in my little brain, I just think this is the fruition of an aha moment that might have begun in Bethlehem.
That is a lot. There is a lot there, isn't there, Esther? I can't wait as we continue this discussion for this painting to mean more and more to us as we go on. So please have this painting in the back of your hearts and minds as we continue this conversation. Because Esther, one of the things that I really like about you is that often when I've like spoken to you in person, and when I've listened to a lot of your talks online, and you talk about how how people probably ask the question, what's a girl like me doing in a field like this, meaning epistemology? What are you doing in the field of knowing? How did you come to the subject to begin with? And then maybe we'll go into some of the particulars of that painting and the things you mentioned.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's the old lady now. What's an old lady like me doing in epistemology? And yes, I love to start opening my mouth and see people kind of change how they look at me. But I have to say, somehow I was a baby skeptic, and that was not something that would have been, anybody at my church would have been pleased at if I'd ever said that. I was sure my questions were sin. And one of them was, and I associate this with about the time I was 13, asking like you, how do I know that God exists? Even though I knew what I was supposed to believe and what, I think I knew my Bible well, but I still didn't. I had the same question I think that you do, and I think lots of people do. But the other question is, how can I know that there's a material world outside my mind? And it seemed to me that, I know this is ridiculous, but it seemed certain to me that I had certain knowledge of the contents of my mind. And just for that reason, that certain knowledge in my mind blocked my being able to get beyond it to see if what was inside my mind went with that, what was outside my mind. And I had no proof, so it was not just that I didn't know about the existence of God, but I didn't have know about the existence of you either. So that's kind of a more fundamental problem. So that was kind of how it started. And it seemed like those were the most important questions, but those were missing the kind of substantiation that I felt was needed to justify them. So that's how it started. I can go on and tell you some more, but
well, before you do, I think it's probably important that you give us some of a little bit of grammar just to understand some of this conversation.
Grammar. Okay.
Grammar. So quick fire questions to you, Esther, before we hear more. What is epistemology? We've used that word a couple of times. What's epistemology?
It's a big scare word, but what it means is study of knowing. And I think perhaps one of the biggest difficulties we all have in the modern age, and when I say modern age, I mean 1600s to the present even more stridently, is the modern age has disavowed philosophical thinking as as not pragmatic. Right. And so useless and therefore to be jettisoned. And so we have, and all that has atrophied about us. So we don't really stop and think about the really fundamental, I call them big, hairy questions of life, which is, what is really real? How do I know it? And what is right and good? And you can throw in, what does it mean to be human? That's another one. Now, we do think about that one a lot, but I don't think we think about reality and knowing. So epistemology would be probing into questions about how is it that we know anything at all? And so if you have questions like that, they're epistemological questions. Mm-hmm. And it, as I say at the beginning of Longing to Know, which is a book for people considering Christianity who have questions about knowing. Right. Okay, what was I going to say? I said at the beginning of that, I can't remember. I lost my train of thought, but those questions, they tend to come up only in some kind of crisis. Or we push down our doubts about them because everybody else looks like they don't have those kinds of problems. And that's what I was doing. And I've decided over the years that considering Jesus Christ is a crisis. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. I think we need to have pity on what somebody who's considering Christianity is up against epistemologically. I just think it calls for a whole lot of dredging up of some epistemological issues that have been squashed by modernity.
And your work kind of takes us on a journey, doesn't it, through those questions? So for you, it kind of started with, how can I know that I am thinking? How can I know that you are thinking? How can I know that there is a world around me that is actually real, that I can engage with? How did you move into those questions? How did you begin this kind of journey that led to, to your many books on this topic?
Right. Well, I didn't know my questions were philosophical until I read Francis Schaeffer in high school. And I didn't know you could study philosophy until after my freshman year of college, and this very enthusiastic philosophy students showed up in my house. And it took me 10 hours to change my life and follow that, because it just seemed like the most important thing that I had to do. So that's how it led out. I will say too, and I think I heard this in your question, in the modern age, and if you think of René Descartes as one of the fathers of the modern age, father of modern philosophy, he's famous for really painting the vision of knowing and reality that I, as a 13-year-old, had, even though I'd never heard a sermon on René Descartes. But it's kind of in the water. But okay, train of thought. I'm not so good remembering my train today. Oh, but modernity is distinct from the centuries before, in that it really foregrounds the question, how do I know? And makes it the question. And so, especially you think with the word certainty that you uttered early on, and Descartes said, look, if it isn't certain, it's not knowledge. Effectively, that means it over the centuries, it becomes less and less cool or even moral to do questions of reality, because all of reality comes into question. So the modern age is inherently anti-real. And so I, of course, was only asking the epistemological questions because that was the only kind of question that modernity was letting me ask. And I did not trust reality. I didn't trust reality. I had no right to. And so when you look at the cycle, I think of them as a cycle of my books. First of all, I've got to deal with the question of knowing God. Can I know that God exists? And then I got to deal with the question, can I know the world? That's what those questions do, or those books explore. And when I get done with contact with reality, I made sure I made the last word beginning, because I finally felt like I had dealt responsibly with epistemology, and now I'm ready to begin talking about the real and exploring the real, which is called metaphysics. So that's where I am. And I've turned from a baby skeptic into a very exuberant realist. And, talk about jargon here. When you say realism at this point in the discussion, what you mean is, if you're a realist philosophically, you believe that there is a world independent of your knowing it. Okay. If you're an anti-realist, you believe that something prevents you from knowing the world as it is, or it blocks you, or somehow conditions your knowing of the world. So modernity is pretty anti-realist.
So yeah, Esther, there's I guess for most of us here, this is probably one of the first times we've ever thought about epistemology. We've ever thought about these big hairy questions, as you put them, and probably one of the first times we've thought about like René Descartes and like the modernist kind of concept of knowing. And so when we're reflecting upon how we think, it's not something that we do every day, is it? Like, why does it matter the way that I think? Because I don't think I think like Descartes does, or I don't think I have those questions about the external world and am I thinking right now? Why do you think this topic matters so much for all of us gathered here this evening, and particularly for those of us who wouldn't call ourselves philosophers or epistemologists, and might be artists or engineers or book publishers or lawyers or whomever we might be?
Yeah. I'd like to adjust the way you're saying what I was considering. It wasn't, I was never in doubt that I was thinking, but what I was in doubt about was knowing God and knowing the world. I do believe that people do think about this all the time, but they hear the word philosophy or the word epistemology and they think, oh, that's not for me. And here's the other thing that's going on. Another reason people would think about this is that I do feel like this approach to knowledge, in terms of certainty and information and facts, is dominating and predominant in the modern age. There's no way we can get away from it. And so we either sign on with that, oh, well, we sign on with it, or, and if we do, then if we have great meaningful moments that I would like to call knowing, we tend to say, oh, well, that's subjective, or it has to do with feelings, right? So we tend to think, all of us kind of buying into the modernist ideal can see science and factual information and collections of that as the paradigm of knowledge. We do talk about aha moments, but we don't even count them as epistemic. We just say that's, oh, our imagination or our subjective passions or something like that. So they get marginalized and delegitimated. And so what we need to kind of get over ourselves is a fresh approach to knowing that builds them into the heart. And that's what I found in the work of Michael Polanyi, who has an England connection, as you might want to explore. So, and a Hungarian connection, Kristi.
I think there might be another Hungarian, at least one on this call from what I saw.
So did I answer the question you were asking? Oh, I know, there was another thing I wanted to say. So you were asking, this is the first time you've talked about, people who are listening to us may have considered these things, but I think we all consider them, because this is a huge conundrum at the heart of us. I think we feel this bodily. And one of the ways it comes to expression is control, right? So you think about the horrors of control that just only get worse and worse. Well, part of what's going on in the modern ideal is that this idea of human mastery over nature, which is fueled epistemologically by control of all the information, the commodification, marketing, of all the information. And so I think we feel that. And yet there's these places where we get it right. And I would like to suggest that deep down below whatever we've inherited in modernity is an approach to knowing and loving the world that's kind of natural to who we are as humans. And that what we need to do is find a way to recover that.
So could you take us there, Esther? It sounds like what you're saying is that the way in which we commonly know results in the commodification of knowledge. It leads to control, and it can lead to power abuse. And knowledge then is pretty much just massing data and information and collecting bits of things. Is there a better way of knowing? And I suppose for those of us who come from backgrounds that are very that would kind of approach knowing from that particular angle, what's actually wrong with it? Are you saying there's something wrong with it? And so what needs to change? What needs to be healed? What is the way forward? So I guess what's wrong with that? And then is there a better way of knowing? And then we'll go to questions. So please put your questions in the chat.
That's great. We're talking about a paradigm of knowing. Like, what's the best model of how knowing works? And if you ask most people, your neighbors, what they think knowing is or what knowledge is, they're going to use words like information and facts and data. And they're going to presume that the goal is certainty. And I would say comprehensive information, to get all the information. And so, freshmen are going off to college today, and they're expecting to go into classrooms, collect all the information, write it down on a test, and consider themselves educated, right? So we tend to think of knowledge as information. So that's a kind of a picture of what knowledge is. And I would like to suggest that there's a truer one and a better one. And so I, in Little Manual for Knowing, I've called the one the knowledge as information mindset, and I've called the other the loving to know mindset, getting at the ideas, my proposals in the book, Loving to Know. And what I would like to do is, at this point, mention Michael Polanyi, who's, when I found his work, was it's unbelievably the key to healing in modernity and in modernist epistemology, not merely, if I can say it that way, for religious reasons. He wasn't particularly a religious person, but just to be a great scientific discoverer as he was. Because what he said was, if knowledge is collecting explicit information, no scientific discovery could ever happen. But it does. So fix your epistemology is what he was saying. So how can we come up with a model of knowing that actually represents what we're doing in groping our way towards some kind of discovery? He was intrigued by the idea of coming up with a good problem. Or think of this word, clue. You know, in some kind of quest that you have to understand something, you grope your way forward and you have to rely on clues. Well, what is a clue? It's something that's only half understood at the time that you have to rely on it. And you can't put into words what it is that it's saying to you. Okay, so what Polanyi argued for was there has got to be more to knowledge than explicit statements. And there has to be a human personal involvement too. And when I say involvement, let me use the Polanyi word too, which is indwelling. You have to actually get inside the clues to put yourself in position to start to open the world before you. And what we've got then in his lingo, and I can explain this more, subsidiary focal integration, it's not linear, is like the dynamic that roots us in the world and opens the world in a surprise to us.
Wow. Thank you so much.
And we do it all the time. I mean, when I say knowledge is so subsidiary focal integration, don't get scared by the words, because you're already doing this, right? You just need to identify it. And then it actually restores you to yourself. And then you go on dancing down the path.
So I think I'd love to go into what that actually means in a couple of minutes, just to try and summarize all the wonderful things you've just said there, Esther, that Michael Polanyi was kind of approaching knowledge, saying that it's not just that we know something if we can express it in a propositional statement. There's something more going on. How do we come to know something and not just use the scientific method for observing and assessing what has already happened or is happening? How do we hit upon a good problem, which I think is how you put it before? And that's where that clue comes in, isn't it?
Right.
How do you know that this is even a good clue or a clue to follow in coming to know something? So that's just quite an interesting shift, isn't it? That the focus is on how do we come to know and not just how do we define knowledge.
Yeah, discovery for him. And Michael Polanyi lived at the beginning of the 20th century. He was a premier scientific discoverer and trainer of Nobel Prize winners, including his son. So there can be something a little elitist about this. You know, it takes genius. You know, Nobel Prize winners aren't going to come out of just any old buddy's lab, he would say to you, in all modesty. You know, but the thing that is the key to science, he would say, is that inarticulable sense that actually is trainable, and can become even more artful. And if I can, did you want to take questions now, or do you want me to continue and say a little bit more about subsidiary focal integration?
I think let's take a pause just for a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Are there any points of clarification that have come up? Any questions? There's one question in the chat. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Any points of clarification? Let's start, Esther. So there's one question that came up, which I think might be teased out a little bit later. And how does our finitude impact our knowing? Because it would seem that that I guess modernist conceptions of knowing is humble in some way, in that we can say this is what we know and we can articulate it clearly. How does this coming to know approach? How do we understand that as finite creatures who don't know where we're going? And so it seems like quite a grander statement in some ways.
Actually, I would like to side with philosopher D.C. Schindler and say that the modesty of modernity is arrogance, and it's a false modesty. And the truly human appropriate approach to knowing is one that does not presume to put limits on what we're able to know. And what we're meant to be as humans is human. You know, when we say we're finite, it's as if we're presuming to be God. And I don't think that's meant. But what we're called to be is humans. And that means we're rooted in a particular place in the world, orienting in the world. And so what we want to do is do that well. And we want something that continues and grows out of our rootedness in the world to connect us more deeply into it. I don't think any baseball player, I guess you need to think cricket, or football player, I guess you need to think American football or whatever. They're not saying we're finite people. And if they were, they would not be professional, right? They're just getting out there and kicking the ball, which is very much a subsidiary, focal, integrated rootedness in the world. And it's beautiful. And it's trainable.
Well, shall we go into that, Esther? What is that subsidiary, focal, integrated rootedness in the world? Gosh, it's quite a mouthful.
Yes. And once you connect it to your own skills, I think you'll be good to go. You'll forget that it's got these big hairy words. I would say, think about riding a bike. Okay. The other one that's really good is thinking about reading. Like reading text. Both of those are fantastic, but this works for any skill because you're doing it. With riding a bike, my story is that my father wanted me to learn, and we were too poor for me to, have been purchased my own bike. So he borrowed a bike that was too big for me. He did not believe in training wheels. And he put me on this big bike at the top of the grassy hill at the back of our yard and pushed me and yelled, "Balance!" Okay, I'm a baby skeptic, right? So all I could think was, what does the word balance mean? I mean, and it was glaringly obvious to me that no human being could keep balanced on 2 points. It was ridiculous. The whole thing was ridiculous. And I think his idea was that by the time I reached the bottom of the hill, I'd be riding. I can't remember the bottom of the hill, but I do love to ride a bike. And so what that story can bring before your mind is how awful even your body felt before you got it about riding a bike, because you were focused on the bike, which was this contraption that didn't make any sense. You were being told to balance. That's a word that doesn't make any sense. And then your body just isn't working out for you at that point. So even your body feels like a blob at that point, at the beginning. before you learn the skill. Sometime along the way, the whole thing shifts and you go from focusing on your body, the bike, the hill, to somehow subsidiarily indwelling those things to focus down the road. So it's a shift of focus, which is what happens in the "oh, I see it" moment. That's just what's happening with the disciples, is they were fixated on the stuff that wasn't adding up. And that's how it was that their eyes were opened in the breaking of the bread. That just switched the picture. Okay. And so when you learn to keep your balance on a bike, you've got this palpable bodied sense of balance. And you know, it can be grown, it can be trained, right? You can get it wrong for a while. You have to, kind of develop that. But that is the best and common example, I think, of subsidiary awareness. And the point is, you are not articulating the physics formula for it at that point. You are subsidiarily indwelling it. You have given yourself in trust to this bike, right? And to the words of the authoritative guide, so that when I taught my children to ride, I yelled "balance too," right? As if it was pregnant with meaning. So all of that comes to be something that we subsidiarily indwell in the integration of the skilled performance that then is that's the very thing that roots us in the world, makes the world open to us in wonderfully possibilities of bike pathways and bike adventures and bike tours, right? So that's this rootedness in the real that opens toward all kinds of fruitful possibilities. That is subsidiary focal integration. The moment in reading is when you finally learn to read. You've figured out what the sounds are. I took a picture of every one of my daughters at the moment when they realized that they were reading, and they went, because the words started to mean. And words do not mean unless you've undergone subsidiary focal integration. That's why I'm saying y'all do this. Everybody does this. If I'm making any sense to you, it's because you're subsidiarily indwelling my words. How we doing?
So, I mean, Esther, this is phenomenal. So really, you're saying that this is paradigmatic of all of our knowing, not just riding a bike, not just reading a book. Every single thing that we've come to learn in our lives, every act that we perform today, every piece of work that we write or put together, every meeting that we hold, we are in some way subsidiarily, focally integrating knowing. And so that is why this way of viewing knowing encapsulates, well, it's all of the world, all of our lives, every single thing. Okay.
And it does it in a healing way. I mean, this is intrinsically therapeutic. It straightens you out. And
go on, let's go there. Tell us, how is it healing?
It's healing. Well, let me say that it's healing, and I bet all of you can think of examples when you finally say, "Oh, I've got it." And when we say, "Oh, I've got it," the world changes and embraces us in this new reality. We're caught up in this new reality that's just beautiful. It's really beautiful. So I would say, first of all, it is healing. And so then I guess I would say a way that I've already said just now that it is healing is it catches us up into a new and fresh world. And part of what goes on with that is we have to let go. We have to let go of some stuff. So there's actually people who have written on James Loder, his students, who connect this to forgiveness, right? So for those poor disciples on the road to Emmaus, they were in a snit. That was terrible. That was awful what they were going through in that walk. And it was only getting worse, right? But at the moment of the aha, they're just caught up in the reality of, Jesus lives and so shall I. It's not about the Romans. It's not about the Romans. It's not about the Jews. It's not, I'm looking at Jesus. Not only is he alive, but I will be forever. Reality is changed to its bottom. And so I would say part of what's going on in healing is letting go of baggage. And then the other thing that's going on is a blessing of baggage too. Only it's God's signature move is taking ashes and making beauty. And that's what happens in subsidiary focal integration.
And so what did, so much to kind of talk about from that, Esther, because what did you add to this? So you've got subsidiary focal integration, and then there's your work that kind of comes alongside subsidiary focal integration, and you kind of add something to that.
Yeah.
What do you add to that?
Yeah, so I like the word augment in place of your word add. And here's the thing that caught me about Michael Polanyi. The subsidiary focal integration, I think, is all those things I've just said. But Polanyi, the discoverer, said something that I had been searching for since I was 13. And I've never before or since heard anybody say, and this is what he'd say, you've made contact with reality in your discovery when you have a sense of the possibility of indeterminate future manifestations. I'll say it again, but I coined the acronym IFM effect, indeterminate future manifestations. You have a sense. It's not something you can put into words. It's unspecifiable. And then he'll say an inexhaustive range of indeterminate future manifestations. That's how a discoverer knows they've got it. And again, back to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, that in that aha moment, they've got a sense of the possibility of indeterminate future manifestations of an overwhelming range. Okay. Well, this is the little girl who wanted to know how to make contact with reality. And Polanyi was using that phrase. It was the water of life on a dry soul. So as I've tried over, and that, it's still, I get chills every time I say that sentence. I can't get over it. I can't get over it. But as I reflected on it over the years and tried to express this to other people, one of the things I would say is, you've made contact with reality, not when it answers your questions, but when it explodes them. Okay? And you find yourself no longer the questioner, but the questioned. That's when you make contact with reality. It's like reality shows up, walks in, takes over, like Prince Caspian in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Says, here I am, right? That's how you've made contact with reality. Well, what has that led me to say is there's something person-like about the real. And then I was spending time with my colleague, Mike Williams, thinking about the covenant, the idea of covenant in the Bible. And he was all about covenant as relationship. And then I was reading Annie Dillard, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. I don't know if that's a book that you would necessarily know, but she describes what she calls stalking muskrats. And when you listen to her lingo, what she's showing is that she is composing herself to covenantal behavior, to live life covenantally on the terms of the yet to be known in order to invite it, which is why covenant epistemology is so called. But what what I'm saying in covenant epistemology is, look, the real is person-like. Best epistemological etiquette is to invite it, not make demands of it. So it's really out of that contact with reality sentence, my favorite sentence, that the idea of the person-likeness, which leads to kind of a reciprocity of overture and response between me and reality, starts to develop. And now, all these years I've said invite the real, which I still say, but I'm also now saying, guess what? The real invited you first.
I have 3 very quick questions for you, Esther, before I ask you about how do we go about inviting the real. That's, gosh, what a sentence right there. One question that comes to mind just earlier on from what you were saying, that we know we've made contact with reality when these indeterminate future manifestations open out. So we kind of make contact with reality when we know that there's more. There are these bike adventures, there's more we could do. But I guess in some ways that kind of addles the mind, because then I think, well, how can I say that I know something if knowing it, I'm actually saying I don't know it, because there are all these options that
Yeah, isn't that great?
So how can I actually say that I know anything? So if I'm trying to make a decision on something, I'm trying to solve a problem, I'm trying to make a life decision, and I think, what should I do, this or that?
Yeah,
I think I don't know how to make it because there are options. That doesn't mean that I know. So how do we go about squaring? No, what's that phrase about? I don't know. How do we go about doing that?
Well, the aha moment comes with a sense that you got it right, even if you've only got it half right. So this approach to knowing is known as, it's got to be fallibilist, which is the opposite of anybody committed to certainty. So you have to own up to the fact that you might be wrong. But what this does is help you see that doesn't mean you're not knowing. Right? So the certainty word, I call it a dangling carrot. It's just not. It belongs in the other paradigm, and really, what you want is your world exploded by reality. That doesn't always happen. So I've got this chapter in Longing to Know called, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we look for someone else?" So you think of John the Baptist, who had the greatest aha moment when he says, "Behold the Lamb of God," and the Lord speaks from heaven, all of that. And he's the one that's in prison awaiting his beheading and asking that question. And so what I argue is resolve is perfectly legitimate as an epistemic act. So in life, sometimes we do have to make a decision. I was thinking about this just today as I drove back to Geneva to see my colleague and passed where I lived a year ago. I moved an hour down the road here last year. And I thought to myself, my golly, I made that decision in 2 days. And look at all of this stuff that I had no idea of, so, but at the time I was saying, and I would still say it was a prudent decision, right? And that's how I think we all navigate life. And then we grow our skill. I mean, knowing is a skill like piano playing is, and you shouldn't expect, to be a concert pianist without a whole lot of time on the piano bench. So I really think, gray hair, comes with just a humbling with regard to with regard to knowing. And what happens is there's things that you know that you don't know, and there's things that you know that you can't put into words, and there's things that you know that you're on the way to knowing. And see, there's all those nuances about knowing that kind of a stock knowledge as information epistemology can't even begin to make sense of, you know. And for Polanyi, if you're going to be a discoverer, you have to have an account of on the way to knowing.
Thank you, Esther. That's really helpful. And so, as you mentioned, your work kind of looks at the personal element of reality that's person-like. Before we go into kind of inviting the real and etiquette, as you kind of put it, what actually is reality? So, what is the real that we're looking at inviting? What is reality, and how do we go about inviting the real, whatever that is?
All right, well, my stock in the streets definition of reality is God and God's stuff. And, you know, it's damning of modernity that if you ask that question that you just asked, Kristi, an 18-year-old is liable to say, do you mean my reality or yours? Which is really, really sad. But they would not utter that if they were in the context of doing a really excellent guitar song or video games, because at least the expert part of it, you know, right? So modernity's kind of put that lingo on us because it's growing out of the Cartesian doubt. But the fact is, we're rooted in reality, and where we're doing the skill well, we don't ask the questions about reality because it's our dance partner, right? So we're quite in touch. So by the way, I'm interjecting this, and I should have said it earlier. If the goal of knowledge on the knowledge as information mindset is comprehensive information, I think the real goal of knowing is communion with the real. And communion is a far richer, more three-dimensional, way more reality honoring word than comprehensive controlled information is. And so our goal is communion with the real. If you just take that into the kitchen, you know, and you think about making spaghetti sauce or, you know, canning or whatever expert kitchen, you know, chefs do that I don't know how to do, you know, that is art. We might call that art, but I would call that knowing, because I would say artistry and knowing are pretty much of a piece. It's communion with reality. And you can throw the word love in there too. You want a dancing love relationship with the real. And that's what we're called to as humans. That's just, it's like, that's the rest of our life and eternity. I don't think it gets any better than that. So did I get off track, or did I answer your question?
Such a beautiful picture, Esther. Thank you. That communion with the real. How do we go about inviting the real then? What kind of epistemological etiquette do we need to grow in or move into in order to make contact with reality?
Well, my favorite chapter in Loving to Know is chapter 15, which is my epistemological etiquette. And the claim is, if knowing is person-like, then best epistemic practices are those which invite, not demand. And so there's in there, and there's like, I've got a catalog of them, but you can make them up too. But I've got 5 loci of practices. And the first one has to do with love or desire. And, you know, I do think that loving invites the real. You know, if you're going to know a child or a horse, it'd be really great if you started with regard and delight. So David Bentley Hart says that delight is a sound premise of any Christian epistemology. How can you expect to know someone that you don't delight in first? So this has apologetic implications, you know. So love and desire, and that whole active receptive sort of dance going on there. The second I call composure, which in little manual I call that readiness to know. So there's things about ourselves that have to do with our composing ourself that is appropriate to invite reality to come. I think of the man of the Gadarenes at that point when the Lord, you know, casts out 1,000 demons. He's sitting there clothed and in his right mind, which, you know, in a sense, we do have to compose ourselves to invite reality to come. Again, you know, a little child is not going to come to an uncomposed person. Probably a horse won't either. I don't know that much about horses, but so composure. The second one is, or the third one is comportment. And so that's a little bit more outgoing than composure. And actually, I put the word pledge or covenant there. So this kind of promising to live life on the terms of the yet to be known, promising to love, honor, and obey as you would do in a wedding, is a comportment. Respect, humility, regard for the other is absolutely essential to knowing a person or an apple tree. So, you know, all of that goes in comportment. And then I love the part strategy, where there's some strategic moves you can make that invite the real. And one of them I call putting yourself in the way of the other. So in other words, placing yourself on the parade route where the parade is likely to show up, you know, or you've got to go to the place on the planet from where you can see a total eclipse of the sun. You know, it's a positioning. If you want to see Jupiter, you got to get behind a telescope. That's what I mean. Choosing wise authoritative guides is strategy. You know, people signing up for classes are choosing which authoritative guides they're going to trust themselves to. Right. And so that's a strategy. And then the fifth one is things related to communion. So once you've got a good thing going, that actually continues to invite reality to come. You know, you put a great chef in a kitchen and communion happens. So that's my little catalog on inviting the real. And a lot of that shows up in Little Manual for Knowing too.
Really, really good, Esther. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to add one more. In strategy is active listening. And one of the things that changes radically when you shift from the defective default epistemology to the one that is true is that listening is no longer passive recording of information, but it actually invites reality to come. So if you're face to face with someone, right, that person can't help but change. Right? There's just nothing about it, and you can't help but change either. And so openness to the face of the other is just unbelievably transformative, and that calls for our listening regard, active listening. And so listening will change the world.
Oh, I wish I was taking notes, Esther. There's so many kind of fruitful implications from what you're sharing with us. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, and is one of the questions here actually in the chat, is on evangelism and discipleship. You mentioned apologetics. How do you think this kind of better epistemology, Caleb asks, should inform Christian evangelism and discipleship to help people have a better understanding of what it means to know God and to know Christianity as true?
Mm-hmm. I think can I speak to the value for evangelism and apologetics? And I have a few things I want to say there. I hope I remember them all, but I want to begin by saying Leslie Newbigin, who's famous for the movement begun with its gospel in a pluralist society. And his successor, David Kettle, I don't know if you know him, but he's got a book that's amazing too. But Newbigin came back to England and realized that it was no longer his ideational home. This was when he retired, but he was a foremost missiologist. And so he set about to figure out how to communicate the gospel to the West. And what he said was, something is stopping the ears of people in the West, so they cannot even hear the gospel. And the answer is, what's stopping it is epistemology, bad epistemology. And he drank deeply at the well of Michael Polanyi's writings. And they're laced throughout Newbigin's work. So I feel like Newbigin threw down the gauntlet that I picked up when I wrote Longing to Know, because what he's saying is, you've got to do epistemology as pre-evangelism. Now, I don't want to take anything from the incredible, overwhelming presence of the Holy Spirit, but that doesn't absolve us of doing our homework, right? It never does. So that means Newbigin, who said, look, people in the West are not even hearing the gospel, pointed to Michael Polanyi's subsidiary focal integration as the way forward. So that you ought to keep that in mind if you're interested in such things. David Kettle talks about how modernist epistemology has domesticated the Christian church in the West. He calls it the winter of Western Christianity. So that, you know, when you become converted, that ought to be a dynamo that transforms everything. So why is that not? Where's the dynamo in our church? Right? So like we've just somehow boxed it in. So what's up with that? Why is it like that? So that David Kettle speaks to that. And again, he follows Newbigin as saying, Michael Polanyi. So you might consider that. Another thing I'd like to say is the interpersonal component in covenant epistemology really does foreground the personal other. And that includes the yet to be believer, right? So, you know, I tend to think that we in the West can think that what I have to do is show up and tell people what they need to know about God. And I would say that's disrespectful of the other. And I also think it might be disrespectful of the Holy Spirit, who might already have been at work there before you got there and just may have something to say to you through that pagan. So I think this injects, you know, in this idea of inviting the real becomes a great way to reach out to the other in a posture that I would say is Christ-like, in a way that they'll be attuned to. And then the last thing I would say is, I really think that subsidiary focal integration, as it's lived, is the sort of thing that allows you to dwell ironically with differences. And ironic is a word that means peaceably, right? And I think we need that within the church. I think we need it between the church and our other neighbors, you know, to make for some sort of dwelling together that doesn't require some kind of repressive homogeneity. And so I commend covenant epistemology for that too. So all of those seem to me, and so I guess I actually have taught covenant epistemology as apologetics at a seminary. And what I saw was students come into the classroom fearful that they were going to have to turn themselves into argumentative, nasty people in the name of apologetics, that then felt freed up and liberated to be themselves and to offer regard to the other, and so invite the real in a very transformative way.
Thank you so much, Esther. There's so much here for us to continue to chew on. I'm very keen for us to put this to everybody else here. So a number of you have put questions in the chat. Thank you so much. I'll start with one of those, and then if there are any questions that come in live, I'll encourage you to unmute your mics and ask in a moment if you'd like to. So let's let's start up here. Rob, as a teacher, he's asking that as a teacher in the humanities, he's been exposed to critical realism. Could you explain how this differs from realism and how we should interact with it as Christians, please?
Well, I probably should do more work on this, but I have said in Loving to Know that I would humbly commend another concocted word of mine, which is covenant realism, because I think when you think of critical realism, you see somebody with their arms crossed saying, oh yeah. And, I taught my students, contrast Zechariah to the Blessed Mother Mary. So Zechariah is standing like this. I mean, they ask the same question, and he's standing there saying, how do I know this? And when she asks the same question, she's got to be in some posture like this because she's just about to get impregnated by the Holy Spirit, So I think that from the point of view of a personal other, a critical stance would be off-putting. And it's not consistent with loving in order to know. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be responsible, okay? But the word critical, typically, growing out of Immanuel Kant and so on, usually is putting the limits on what we can know, right? Which I think is inherently ascetic. Do you know the word acedia? So it's a refusal to consent to reality, which I think is endemic in modernity. And so it's kind of putting on the brakes and say, oh, we couldn't possibly know what something really is, so I would commend as a superior word, especially for the believer, who's been, what can I say? The Lord walked in and took over your life and you're not the same. You gotta, it's pretty humbling. And maybe our posture shouldn't exactly be like this with regard to reality. So I tend to say, well, let's talk about an exuberant realism or a covenantal realism, where reality is best invited by my pledge to love, honor, and obey it. If I want to care for a rose bush, I got to live life on its terms. And that's because this is God's world. But even if I don't know it's God's world, if I want to take care of the rose bush, I've got to do it the rose bush's way.
Thank you, Esther. I'm going to go through these questions. Philip asks, is there always something we do not know about any one thing? Oh, sorry, that wasn't a question, that was a statement. There is always something we do not know about any one thing. How do we fill this gap to say we know that thing?
Well, I think G.K. Chesterton is all over this. but if you have known something in an aha moment, what you are sensing are depths that are beyond your knowing. And that's exactly how you know it's real. And all I would say is, welcome to God's world. We've got an infinitely deep creator. Of course, his creation is going to be infinitely deep. And you want to splash in that. So I think a Chesterton way of saying it would be, this is a mystery that makes you know that you know, right? So, and all you need to think about is knowing your mother or your spouse. At this point, if you've written the book on your spouse, maybe she should leave you, right? I'm being, playful, but isn't that true? You better from before the altar on, be in awe of the mystery. but it's just the mystery that you know and love, but it's so beyond your articulation. And that's merriment, not frustration. This is, we are not by covenant epistemology compelled to say, oh, we have to settle for something less. Oh, no, it's exactly the opposite. This is the exuberant more of reality.
Thank you so much, Esther. We have more questions here in chat. I'll put them to you in a moment. But before I do, any questions just from the floor, as it were? Are there any questions that have come up as a result of what Esther shared in the past 5-10 minutes at all that you'd like to ask?
By the way, I'm dying to know all of you. And if you want to email me, I'd love it. You could reach out to me through my website, Esther Lightcap Meek. And if you wanted to be on my update list, you can check that too. But I would just love to hear a little bit from you, which we're not going to get to in these 2 hours, I feel sure.
Well, feel free to unmute yourself or raise a hand. If not, I'll go through the chat. So I'll give you 30 seconds to decide if you'd like to do that while I go through these questions. And please do keep sharing them in the chat if that's easier. Susie, were you going to say something? I saw an angling there. No.
No, I can just express how delighted I am so far. And I did put a question in the chat about my first experience with Michael Polanyi through Ken Myers, and just the way that Esther's describing her encounter with Michael Polanyi is so similar. And it was actually Richard Winter who I was talking to him. Yes, I was talking to him about Michael Polanyi, and he said, oh, you've got to get in touch with Esther's work. So that's what introduced me to you a few years ago. So, but I don't know if I should ask my question here that I put in the chat is, I recently read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. So you're not familiar. So anyway, maybe that's just a suggestion. I think you would love it because it's similar to this tacit knowing, truthful knowing, the way I encountered Michael Polanyi through Ken Myers, and just that knowing. She has her PhD, she has the academic prowess, but she's a Native American, and so she draws upon that transmitted knowledge of her forebears, and how to the reciprocity between us and the earth, and then just how we have, with our economic commodification of things, worked against so much of this. So
will you put that in the chat, that her name and his name and the book? And
yes, I did.
What else that sounds like is Wendell Berry. I just did an interview with Front Porch Republic. For the first time, I got to connect my teaching of his remembering with my own work in the last few weeks. It's out there, but he's all over that too.
Well, he's a favorite too. I grew up in Kentucky, and he's of course a Kentuckian, and yeah, his Life is a Miracle. Yeah, you're speaking my language.
Good. Good.
Thanks so much, Susie. Right, let's go on then to the next question. David here has asked, did the old translations of the Bible therefore get it right in describing a man having sex with his wife as him knowing her?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel as I move forward in thinking about metaphysics, though I'm talking about the real, and you already hear it in covenant epistemology, that the knower yet to be known relationship is intimate. And I think Calvin gets this too, that there's this intimacy about knowing, that somehow you can imagine a stiff introduction between two people, where the frightened person comes with his hand out, and the welcoming person kind of brushes away the hand and hugs that person, right? So it's like it's a game changer to move from an indifferent, distanced, object over there, me and here over here, which is, the kind of the modernist model, to something more of an intimacy. And what I'm saying now is the real invites, and I'm painting that as hospitable welcome, which I think is utterly consonant with God, this being God's let there be. If this is not everywhere your eye lands, if this is not a welcome to his party, his Trinitarian party, I don't know what it is. So I think so yes, back to intimacy, that knowing idea. Yeah, there's something to that. It's embodied too, and as any good marriage partner would know, there's all the body is just like only one part of it. I mean, there's got to be this overwhelming sense of mystery and respect and regard in which that comes to fruition, and all of that has a profound intimacy, I guess I would say, and mystery, I would say, about it.
David says, this seems to me to be in the same territory as the theological language of participation. Would you agree with that, Esther?
David, you probably know more about the theological language of participation than I do. I've had to do a lot of, I've called myself being in a novitiate to try to learn some of these things in the last decade. And since I found David Schindler's work, DC Schindler's work. But participation, I know that people use that at a similar junction to where I am, but I haven't got, so that's my language yet. And to me, I mean, I like the word perichoresis. And I hear the word participation, and it sounds a little too suffocating to me. Whereas the idea of perichoresis, which kind of morphed into being about dancing around, and I get this from Colin Gunton, the idea that you shouldn't have a tension between the one and the many, but you ought to have this interplay between individuality or particularity and relatedness or relationality, so that if you've got a great dance couple, the individuals that they are feed the beauty of the dance, and the beauty of the dance enhances the individuals that they are. And so that's a kind of relatedness that I think we need to see in the knowing venture, as overture response, which allows the other, it gives regard to the other as other, right? Without me trying to absorb. Absorption's not cool. So that's the best I can do with that word right now. And if you want to tell me what I need to read so I can get a little bit more with the lingo or find out whether I agree with it, send that along, please.
Thanks so much, David and Esther. This next question to you, Esther, I think comes up quite a bit. So I'm keen to ask you, because this is a question that I get asked when I kind of share your work as well. And so Rob's put it really well. He's asked, how should we think about sin's effect on our capacity to know in this life?
Yeah, that's great. And it does come up. And I want to say, I think the answer needs to be epistemological, and say, if you were going to invent an epistemology, would you want one that had sin in it as a component, or was was a description of the way we ought to know, and an account of knowing that shows that knowing would be vulnerable to sin. And I opted for the latter. Okay, so in my tradition, there's talk about the noetic effects of the fall, the noetic effects of sin, which means sin affects not just our will, but our understanding. Well, think about sitting in a church where the pastor's preaching on the noetic effects of sin. I mean, aren't you going to ask, well, how far did the noetic effects of sin go on your sermon? Right? In other words, it's like intrinsically undercutting. You can't deal sin in at the origin, which I think is just a truly biblical understanding. What we've got is, in the beginning, God created, before the fall. Sin's not a component in the way that goodness is, right? My former student, Drew Johnson, I don't know if you know his work, but he talks about the paradigm act of coming to know in Genesis 2, where the Lord, shows Adam all the animals. And then when he presents Eve, he goes, oh, that's how it works before sin enters the picture. But when you've got knowing a la covenant epistemology, yeah, if you've got a besetting sin, I pray in the morning, we follow too much the devices and desires of our own hearts. Well, you pick a device in your heart. Let's say you don't you're lacking self-confidence. Well, guess what? That's going to get in the way of your knowing, right? And that's because knowing has this incredibly rich structure that involves inviting the real. You can't invite the real very well if you're not composed in yourself. I mean, just as an example, any sort of sexual betrayal is going to make it that freshmen showing up in my classes are not ready to know. And that means their act of coming to know needs to start with their own healing as a person. So I feel that I would say you want an epistemology that says, look, this is how it works. And it shows how it works in such a way that sin would really be shown to warp your knowing. So you don't want sin in the epistemology, you want it in the knowing, if that makes any sense. Hopefully that
does. Thank you so much, Esther. And I see that Caleb has raised a hand, so please go for it, brother.
Thank you. No, that's really, really helpful. I wonder whether the category of sort of sin's effective knowledge, but how you think that can perhaps help with maybe giving a partial affirmation to some of the more skeptical epistemological things. So I'm thinking of something like Foucault and knowledge being power, and it's very much construed by power. And you can kind of say, well, in a sort of sin distorted epistemological practice, that might actually be descriptively true, and you can kind of affirm there's some reality to that, but then it's not making that your baseline. You actually want to say it doesn't have to be like that. There is a better way of knowing that doesn't necessarily entail all of that dysfunction and all of those problems. So I guess the question is, does the category of sin and the noetic effects of sin give us a helpful tool for engaging some of those alternative epistemological frameworks?
Well, yes. A big example being modernist epistemology. You want to talk about the noetic effects of sin? Talk about the modern age. And that's what Foucault is doing. Foucault helps us see the power component, right? So I'm picking up on what you said there, but I really feel, in in the modern age itself and our installation of the knowledge as information mindset, that's the noetic effects of sin.
Thanks so much, Caleb. I'm aware that we only have, I think, a couple of minutes or so left. So we have two very quick questions for you, Esther. I'm very keen to get through the ones that you've shared in the chat, everybody. Thank you so much. This one's from Mark, and he asks, please could you share your view of, I can never pronounce this guy, Duived and Kuyperian roots, and his Kuyperian roots. Was his model of knowing and its consequences, the sphere of sovereignty, ideas, etc., was this valid?
Okay, so I'm not as well acquainted as Duiviardians with Duiviard. I have had concerns growing out of my acquaintance with a neo-Calvinian approach of worldview at Geneva, as I've run into it, in the halls of Geneva, and it's been presented pretty rampantly, I'd say, and I know this isn't as this is maybe off from what I should know about Duiviard, but the idea that worldview is pre-theoretical and is a concern to me, because most people don't know philosophy and they don't know Michael Polanyi to know that that's just the beginning of your philosophizing, not the ending of it. And so I've become less enamored of we all have radically different perspectives and commitments that shape our way of seeing the world. I guess I'm not there anymore. I know we do, but even if we do, there's just there's great philosophizing to do out of that, and I feel like our fundamental belief commitments are meant to be at the from, as opposed to the to, and they ought to root us in the world. And it seems to me that there's a lot of commonality to be explored. Now, I realize another Duiviardian word would be the heart. And I actually do have an excursus in Loving to Know on common grace and antithesis that you might want to look at. That's probably as far as I got in my thinking on these things. I'm more in the Van Tillian framing sort of approach, but I do think that a fundamental rebellion against God is going to make it that you get a lot of things wrong. But I also argue that as long as God is Lord, you're going to get a lot of things right. Otherwise, he's not Lord. So I tend to the more common grace-ish sort of approach. And then the last thing I would say is I am in a position of arguing that knowing works this way in every field. So that might sound a little less silo-esque than a Duiviardian approach, but I haven't really considered that.
Thanks so much, Esther. I really feel like we could continue this conversation for hours and hours and hours. I can't thank you enough for your time this evening. And
it's great to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There was one last question, which was on recommended reading from the scientists. That's Michael Polanyi. What would you recommend to read? What would be the recommend?
There is a Polanyi Society, and it's and Polanyi Zoom meetings even are free discussions, and we're all Polanyans, which means we're incredibly welcoming. So let me say that. Polanyi's magnum opus, his Gifford lectures, is called Personal Knowledge. If you have a scientific orientation, you just might want to start with that. But then in addition to that, he wrote a bunch of different like standalone essays. I mean, there's a ton of them. And maybe the best collection of them was made by philosopher Marjorie Green, who assisted him in his work, but is, the philosopher that he really never was. And that collection is called Knowing and Being. And you can follow Marjorie Green's incredible grasp of Polanyi in her very pithy intro there. And then she curates that collection of her favorite essays. So you might look there. There's plenty on, to be found at the Polanyi Society. Another collection is a series of 3 lectures called The Tacit Dimension. Yeah. When I was there in Cambridge giving a paper, I was picking up also on the fact that Polanyi was at Manchester when Alan Turing was. And they were directly opposed about whether, machines can think. So they together, Turing and Polanyi, put on, a series of meetings around that. So that might interest you with regard to location.
And Robert says that he's just reserved a copy of Personal Knowledge from Norfolk's excellent library service. Well done, Robert.
Yeah.
This really to the end of our time. I again just want to thank you again so much for your heart, for your wisdom, for your careful work and attention, particularly in this area of epistemology. And Professor Meek, it's a real joy to have spent this time with you, and I'm sure we all agree. And I can see emojis going up already of hands clapping. So I'm going to clap on everybody else's behalf.
Thank you. And I want to know, do I no longer look like an old lady?
I don't know where you're getting this from. Anyway, on that note, I'm handing back to Joshua. I hope I can't see him.
Just before you cease your contact with the reality of this webinar, please allow me to add my thanks and the thanks of the whole Christian Heritage team to Esther and Kristi and to you all for being here tonight. Of note, particularly if you've really enjoyed this webinar, is that our next event, which is after a few weeks, it will be in October the 11th, which is also a Monday at the same time, 7:30 British Summer Time. We're going to be having an event which is quite a good follow-up to this, in that Matthew Peckham, who is an artist and a philosopher, much influenced himself by Esther, will be giving a talk on aesthetics and the knowledge of God. And he'll be picking up his idea of orthopathos, or right feeling, as a very ripe category for our knowing. So that's October the 11th. Please put it in your diary if that's of interest. Also free. And it will be in person and online. So we're excited. We're breaking back into the round church. We're getting in-person events going, but we're also pumping them all over the world by the wonders of modern technology. A week after that, and I hope Andrew is still online. He has been around. I think he is. I think he can hear me. We've got Andrew's autumn series beginning, which is the doctrine of God for a secular age, an exciting exploration of what the Christian God means for people living in modernity. And that will be, as I say, beginning the following week. So that's October 18th and running for 3 probably consecutive Mondays. So you're warmly invited to that as well, in person at the Round Church and then live streamed. So we do hope you'll give us the chance to get to know you more in the coming weeks and months. Once again, Esther, Kristi, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, and thank you everyone.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Kristi. Thank you all.
Good evening to you all.
Bye-bye.